Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Andrew, and today we're going to do something a little bit different where we're just going to kind of have a conversation here. I'm going to walk through my favorite processing methods and plugins that I use across the board when mixing live sound. Just for a little bit of context, I've been mixing live sound now for about 15 years. I've primarily done it in large churches. So production heavy church is kind of my sweet spot of where I tend to work. And right now I am working on a weekly basis for Red Rocks Church in Denver, Colorado. So just running through everything, I have a couple notes here just to make sure that I don't miss anything huge. But we'll just start with drums and roll through all the other instruments and everything else and just see where we go. All right, so drums. Most of the EQ processing I do on drums, I do in console. I am not running everything to waves and using a bunch of fancy plugins for that. It's just in console. I find it's quicker, faster, easier, all that. If I were to use a waves plugin for EQ on drums, it would typically be just something basic like an F6. That's a plugin that can be used for dynamics, but I often find myself using it just as a simple EQ. I think it's the most user-friendly waves EQ, and in the live world, waves plugins are pretty much your only choice right now. So that's kind of my go-to. If maybe on snare, if I were going to send it to waves and use a more fancy, analog style EQ, I am a fan of the SSL EV2 plugin. Now that is distinctly different from the non-EV2 variant. So I think it's the E channel is the normal Waves SSL channel strip. I think it sounds fine, but I think it feels digital to me, whereas the EV2 is granted a much heavier processing plugin, but it sounds so much better and a lot more analog. And if I'm gonna use an analog style EQ, that's what I want. Why would I want a digital sounding one if I could just use the console EQ? So that is my standard EQ for drums. When it comes to compression, I do tend to use waves. I typically find that consoles EQs are really solid, but their compressors sometimes fall down a little quicker. So when it comes to compression, I typically want to go for something pretty basic. So I'm a big fan of just the emo D5 wave channel strip thing. It's basically, it has a gate, compressor, limiter, de-esser. It has a whole bunch of stuff in it. But I'll just use it oftentimes for the compressor because it's very basic. It has attack and release parameters. You're not just guessing with whatever, fancy analog plugin has in there. You have real full control over that. So I like doing that. I also really like the Audio Tracks plugin, I think it's called, from Waves, just for the compressor in there. It's really a basic plugin, and I don't think it's necessarily very good for a lot of stuff, but the attack and release on it just seem exaggerated to me. Just the effects of attack and release really do what they're told, I guess is a way of saying it. And so especially with drums, when I want to be able to control how much pop I'm getting out of it and all of that, I really do like the Audio Tracks plugin. So that's a good one. Another plugin I use basically every time I can, specifically on kick and snare, is the Smack Attack plugin. This is a transient designer just to be able to just make it kind of sound like the drum was hit with a little more intention than it always is. If they hit it really well, it doesn't really hurt the sound very much, but if they miss a little bit or it's just kind of lighter, it'll kind of bring things up and make it sound like a more impactful hit. Especially in church settings where sometimes the drummers can't even hit that hard, they're not supposed to for volume or whatever, that can be useful. It's also useful when they can whack as hard as they want on it. You don't have to use it, but I really like it. Another one that is huge with drums is the In-Phase plugin. This one can be a little tricky, but basically you use it to make sure that two different sounds are in phase with each other. So this is critically important when you're miking any source with more than one microphone. So if you just have one snare drum microphone on the top, you probably don't need to worry about this too much. But if you're doing top and bottom snare mics, this can make a huge difference to make them kind of sound cohesively as one. Same with kick drum. We have 2 kick drum mics in the kit right now, but I typically only use one. And we have swapped out the kick recently because we replaced the drum set. Long story. But I found in the previous drum set, I really only wanted to use the kick out mic. And on this one, I really only need to use the kick in mic. So use 2 kick mics. That's fine, but I find it's a lot simpler and more reliable to just use one, get the sound you want out of it, and then you don't have to worry about the phase with the kick. I worry enough just getting the 2 snare drum mics in phase. Another thing to note that's really important is if you are sending some drum signals out to waves and not all of them, you need to pay attention to the extra latency that's being sent and delay the other ones that you're not sending to waves, whatever amount you need to, so that they all come back in time. If you don't, it's not the end of the world, but it would make the drum set sound a lot less cohesive than you might want. All right, that's a lot about drums. Moving on to bass. My go-to compressor for bass is the 1176. You can use the end console stuff on bass, totally fine. But if you have it, why not use it? The 1176 on fastest possible attack and just off of fastest release with 4-to-1 on the black setting is typically my go-to. I will sometimes take that attack and bring it to the about 10 o'clock area on the compressor. I find that just sometimes lets things out a little bit more, gives the bass a little more attack to it. But most of the time, I really do like that sound of the super fast compressor on the bass. If I wasn't going to use an 1176, I do have a couple alternatives that I'll occasionally go to if it's just not the style I want. The LA2A and the DBX 160 are both great on bass. They are a lot slower, smoother compressors. So it's a completely different tonal character. If I were you, I would just try all the different ones and figure out, which of those 3 you prefer best. I find myself mostly in the 1176, but for different styles of music, the LA2A or the DBX 160 can be great. All right. The next thing I do is a little controversial and doesn't always work in every scenario. So this is not a blanket statement. I do this 100% of the time. But I do find that it can make a really cool, big difference, specifically in live. So I will use R bass and low air plugins to just beef the bass up like crazy. So I will set the R bass, the frequency on about 40 hertz, and I'm not using a ton of it. So I'll set the amount down at -15. And what this does is it basically takes all the frequencies below 40 hertz that the bass is making, and basically, I'm not 100% sure how it works. It sounds great. That's all I really need to worry about. But it basically takes the super low stuff and adds upper harmonics or something to basically make it so that those lower frequencies are more obviously heard by your ear. And then low air kind of does the opposite. So I have that set at either 80 or 100 hertz. It kind of depends on the player. And then the low and low air knobs, I typically just take to just 0. I think it starts at 3 or something. But you do that, and that takes everything below 80 or 100 hertz and gives it a further lower octave. So the combination of those two does a really cool, interesting thing where it just makes the bass just feel like a thick wall of sound. It does this just encompassing just blanket of low end that I typically can't really get that sound with anything else. Now, don't overuse these, and also be aware that some bass players have plenty of that super low end stuff and you just don't need it. But especially if you have bass players that like to play a little higher on the neck and higher notes, this can really just round out the sound of everything and just glue the low end of your mix together in a way that is awesome. Another thing I do that I'm not really doing right now actually, but I've done in the past and have loved, and I kind of want to get back around to doing it, is running a parallel bass channel where I use the Waves GTR plugin on, so it's basically just an amp simulator, and I like the over bass setting as far as like the model. I can't remember what cabinet and microphone I like, but you can just try them out and figure it out for whatever you like best. And then you filter it really aggressively. So, you know, nothing below like 250, maybe even 300, and nothing above certainly like 800, maybe even lower. But you basically just get this really crunchy mid-range overdone sound, and then you blend just a little bit of that in with the normal bass tone, and that allows the bass to still have the super thick low end from the original way that we talked about. And then you blend in kind of a gritty higher frequency note with it that just makes it pop out of the mix a lot better. And when you can hear that, it also kind of lets your brain fill in all the different frequencies below it. It just does really cool stuff. And I think I need to get back around to doing that now that I talk about it. All right, electric guitar. This one, I have gone back and forth over the years on how to get good electric guitar tone. And honestly, what it just comes down to, and this is super frustrating, but it just comes down to the player themselves need to have good tone. And you can't really fix it on the console side, especially because guitar players tend to play with such wide dynamics of, they'll play a really high thing and then a really thick thing, and then they'll play with tons of reverb and not very much reverb, and it's too wide of a variety to really do that much processing to it and have it consistently work. Now, I have gone down the road in the past of trying this whole F6, like constantly moving dynamic thing. It kind of can work, but you really have to be on it, and especially in a church setting where different players are rotating in and out on a weekly basis, it becomes too much a lot, and you'll find that what you're doing is actually doing more harm than good. So my standard thing these days is I will high pass the guitar to like 160 or 180, so nothing below that gets through, and then I will low pass to typically around 12K. If it's really bright, sometimes I'll take it down all the way to maybe like 6.5K or something. But the more I've been messing with all this stuff, the less I'm doing that. And then if they have an overall tonal issue, we'll call it, where they're consistently too bright or consistently too thick, I will just take the normal console EQ with a pretty wide band and do subtle adjustments. I have just found that, you know, it gets you the best results to not mess with it too much. When it comes to compression, I also am pretty subtle. So I typically just use the console compressor, 4:1 ratio, 5 millisecond attack, 50 millisecond release, just doing a couple of dB of compression, and that just kind of like makes them sit still a little bit so they aren't, if anything, if they play something real fast, it doesn't jump out like crazy. But that has been successful for me recently, where just a really basic, subtle compressor, barely doing anything, honestly, but also mostly doing just something. So there is a fine line there of, I do want the compressor engaged. It does hold them still in a good way. That has been really good. If I were to use Waves, I would probably use kind of that D5 emo compressor. Again, that thing is just basically a console channel strip, so I'm looking for basic here. I have found, if I have the option of sending guitars to Waves, that the SSL EV2 plugin can do some really cool, just like warming up, kind of giving it an analog sound, and kind of also gives you that opportunity to make really broad, smooth adjustments. I made a video about that you guys can check out if you want, but right now, I don't have Waves. I don't have guitars being sent to Waves. So I'm just using the console, and the guitars are sounding completely fine. All right, moving on to acoustic guitar. Now this one is just, it is the bane of every live audio engineer's existence, is the acoustic guitar, because the overwhelming majority of acoustic guitar signals that you get are just not even close to right. Now, I am very lucky in my current situation where, for the most part, I get sent guitars that actually sound pretty darn good. But I have spent year after year just struggling with acoustic guitars in the past, and that's taught me a couple of things. So number one, I typically just use the console EQ, but do not be afraid of EQing that guitar. The situation, the way that you are getting that audio signal is such an unnatural way to record an acoustic guitar in general. Like, the way to record an acoustic guitar is with the microphone in front of the guitar, pointed exactly where you want it, and then they play it. That just doesn't work in a live scenario. And so they're using some sort of like a pickup or like a mic inside the guitar pointed out, and you're gonna need to make some adjustments to make it sound anywhere near natural, most likely. And so just don't be afraid of really digging into EQ in certain places. Do what you need to do to get it to sound good. I've recently been doing something really interesting with compression that I've been loving, which is basically, in this scenario, I'm already being sent a really nice guitar sound, but the dynamics of it don't always fit within the big dynamics of songs or whatever. And so I've been using a super slow compressor. So I've just been using the built-in console one, but I will set the attack all the way as slow as it'll go at like 120 milliseconds, and then the release at 400 milliseconds. And just basically what you do is you listen for when they play in quiet parts, and you set the volume there. And then typically when a big part is happening and they're really digging into it, it'll be too loud. And you just set the compressor, you just keep lowering that threshold until it's as loud as you want. And it just does this magical thing of it just holds the guitar in place. It still allows the like impact of each string to poke through because of that really slow attack. It's been really cool. Something else I like to do on guitars or acoustic guitars specifically, and only sometimes if it's needed, but sometimes it can completely save an acoustic guitar, is de-essing it. So you think of a de-esser as being used only for vocals, and for many years, that's the only way I used it. But man, de-essing an acoustic guitar can sometimes be exactly what you need, because in those really light moments, you want the high sparkly things. And then when they dig in, it just gets harsh and nasty up there. And so just knocking that down with a de-esser can be really great. So I've really enjoyed using that. So yeah, if I were to use waves, it'd probably just be like the D5, maybe that, the audio tracks as well, just to really emphasize certain transients or whatever. And then my favorite de-esser is typically our de-esser, so I'd probably put that on there, and I'm sure it'd sound great. Kind of a similar thing with the SSL EV2. I haven't done it very often, but that just feels like an obvious win, probably, to have that on there. That probably couldn't hurt anything. So you could definitely use that plugin and get great results with it as well. Moving on to piano and keys. This one, I'm, still like pretty much always using that console EQ. I'm finding that basically on every single keyboard type thing, even the best ones, oftentimes, I will need to do some sort of like mid-range cut to take out some of the just busyness that the piano can add to the whole mix. So I will do a cut probably around like somewhere in like 500, and then probably another one, maybe a little lower, like 200 or 300. And then I'll often high pass. I think right now I'm doing a high pass at 170, but I'm doing a 6 dB per octave. So it's a more gradual fade out of the low end. I do want that piano to be nice and thick and rich and warm. So this is gonna vary, definitely, depending on your piano. Some are really bright and you have to just like take out a ton of the brightness to be able to get them to sound thick and nice at all. But most of the time I find that it's kind of the other issue where there's too much like thickness in the piano, and I often will also do just like a high shelf. Basically do a big high shelf and move it back down lower until things get harsh, and then move it up a little bit just to get a little extra sparkle. As for compressor, I'm not really, especially with a digital like keyboard, those tend to not be crazy dynamic, and I do want the piano to still have some dynamics to it. So I'm not typically compressing very much, if any, honestly. I made a whole video talking about how you can use attack and release to really place the piano in the mix, like depth-wise. So I definitely use it in that way. I'll link the video probably up there, I believe, to where you can watch that after this if you're interested. But that general technique is really the only thing I'm typically doing with a piano. Every once in a while, I'll get a piano that's really dry, and I do actually send some of it to just like some of the vocal reverb or something, just to kind of give it even more distance if that's something that I'm looking for. But a lot of times, good piano players on nice pianos will already have kind of like a built-in reverb that's really subtle, and then that's all you need. You don't need some huge reverbed out piano most of the time. All right, moving on to vocals. This is obviously just like a super critically important input. So I mean, you need to spend a lot of time focusing on this. And for me, if the vocals aren't right, I'm not moving on to the other stuff. Like, the vocals need to be right. The vocals need to sound good. That is what every average person walking in and hearing your mix is really going to be focusing on. They don't care about your snare reverb. You know, they want to hear the vocal. And so figuring out your vocals is critical. You don't have to use waves on vocals. I almost always will if I can, but I've also gotten fantastic sounding vocals just with a console EQ and compressor. My favorite thing to do if I'm just going to have the console compressor is set a attack of 13 and a release somewhere between 150 and like 220 typically. That I often find gives me the best compression results. It varies depending on console, but I also tend to like a really soft knee and high ratio. So I'll do like a 20-to-1 with a really soft knee. And if you do that, you really got to dial in the threshold just right. But that can do really great things. And if you don't have a lot of other tools or just want to have a simple vocal chain, that can be really actually quite fantastic. But if I'm going to use waves, and most of the time I am, I tend to start with actually the console EQ. So I will do a just very subtle, light console EQ for how to just, normal vocal EQ, especially have the high pass filter on the console. I want to make sure that that's on the console so that it's for sure in. Then I will take it to waves. And my first step that I will do is the Shep 73 plugin, which is a 1073 EQ modeled plugin. I will typically take the band to the like 360, I think is marked. They don't have a lot of options in there. I think it's 360 and do like -4 dB cut there. That does a really cool thing where I don't even know exactly what the curve itself is doing, but it just takes away a lot of the boominess and like muddiness that you get in a live vocal. If you're in a studio environment, you probably don't need to do this. But when you have like a dynamic mic or even condensers, like just live stage microphones, they're up on that mic and moving around like crazy, and it can get really muddy vocal sounds. And so that helps just right off the bat alleviate that. Side note, I've recently been trying this, and I think the results have been really good. I haven't fully shifted over to it yet, so caveat here, but the VEQ4 does a very similar thing. I typically would set it at like, I think it's 330 on there, and then cut some of that out of it. But that one tends to do it smoother. So I would kind of put it this way. If your PA is really muddy and dark, probably stick with the Shep 73. That adds like a brightness in a way that can be really nice and add like clarity. The VEQ4 doesn't do that, but it also doesn't add the harshness that the Shep 73 can bring sometimes. So it's a balancing act there. Kind of feel like long term I'm going to end up on the VEQ4, but right now I've been rocking the Shep 73 and loving it. So there's that. For compression, this is my absolute favorite vocal compressor chain. And I've tried so many other things until one guy mentioned it in a video one time. And I was like, there's no way that works. Totally works. The CLA 2A with a CLA 2A, like two of the same plugin, back to back. It's really interesting. But you take the first one and you make it go probably 5 to 10 dB on big moments for them. Really, that's your main compressor. You take the second one and you have that one only hit like 2 dB. And you wouldn't think that would make a big difference, but it just like locks in the vocal in a way that is so transparent in the way that it compresses, and you got to try it. It's great. It is my absolute go-to vocal compressor chain right now. I love it. After that, I will typically do a little bit more EQ. And so my standard EQ in Waves, just for ease, is F6. I'm definitely not always using the dynamic features of it. So don't feel like just because it has it there that you need to use it. It can be really helpful, but again, with dynamic stuff, it is so just like touchy as far as if you're making it better or not. And in scenarios where people are changing and there's a lot of variables, I just find that there are too many things going on to make sure that every single dynamic band threshold for every single microphone after all of this other stuff is right. It can be great, but word of warning with that. After I do a little bit of EQ, and also, by the way, that tends to be pretty subtle EQ, typically pretty wide. I'm typically just taking out some like mid-range. The PA I'm on right now is very aggressive. It's sharp. And so I tend to have to take out some of those like harsher frequencies. So I'm really worried about the like 1 to 4K range. De-essing after that. I de-ess after compression, and I am a firm believer in it. I just don't have a really hard time finding a threshold spot on de-essers before compression. It just doesn't really make sense to me. I've had much better success with it after. So anyway, something that Jesse O'Brien mentioned to me, who is the broadcast guy for Red Rocks, that has worked in a couple scenarios and been really, really great when it does work, is taking that de-esser plugin and instead of just, de-essing the high end, use that high end as the filter, so it only looks to the high end for when to compress. But then it actually just is a basically normal compressor. It addresses the whole frequency spectrum, and especially on vocals where the harsh S part of their voice is kind of lower, kind of in that like 2K range, I found that using the wide band option can be great. It can also mess other people up, so be careful with it. And I would typically start with the traditional way, but that has really helped me out a couple of times. After that, I tend to use PSE, which is basically a gate. For any sort of lead vocal, this is a very, very subtle thing. Like this is set at like -40, like it's way down there. And is really just for like really quiet moments. Their mic will turn itself down. Like I think I have it set at like -10 or something. So it'll cut 10 dB out of it if they're really not on it. But I really want to make sure that it's not messing up any sort of lead vocal. Now, on a background vocal, I will get pretty aggressive with this thing. So especially because the stage I'm on right now, no drum shield, and it's not that small of a stage, but it's not a huge stage either. So it gets loud up there, and our vocalists like walking around and getting energetic. And so sometimes they'll walk right next to the drum set, and there is just cymbal galore going through that microphone, and also snare drum. Like sometimes your snare will sound out of phase or like empty and hollow. It may be because it's coming through your vocals. So just watch that. But on background vocalists that I know are not leading a section, I will be much more aggressive with PSE. Not terribly aggressive. Like if they're on the mic and singing, it shouldn't really be doing anything. But I will be much more willing to cut out kind of their softer moments because I'm probably not even really using them anyway, honestly. Sorry. After that, I tend to do a super, super light WNS, which is just another noise suppressor plugin. But I tend to just do kind of the low end. This one's really subtle, maybe just like, from 200 to 500-ish area, I think. probably. Just kind of like 5 dB, and most of the time it's not doing it, but just like, this is another thing to combat the snare drum de-thickening or whatever issue that I've been having every once in a while, where if they're not on the mic and they're just kind of holding it and they hit the snare drum, it'll go in through both, and then it'll basically phase with itself through different sources. And by taking out some of the low end in the microphones when they're not on it, it helps not allow the phasing to happen as much. It's kind of a complicated chain. Oh, I completely forgot. I start this whole thing with Waves Tune. I used to do Waves Tune at the end, and I did some back-to-back testing and found that it was actually, I don't have an explanation for why this happened, but it felt like it was making things harsher. And just the actual tuning itself seemed pretty similar, but it seemed to affect the tonality for some reason. So I now put the Waves Tune first thing in the chain, set the key to the song. I typically don't mess with the speeds too much. Every once in a while do, but if you have a really good singer, sometimes setting it at like 30-80 instead of 15-120 can be good. Or just leave it at 15-120. It honestly sounds great in its default setting, so probably just leave it there. All right, after I do all of that with the vocals, I love sending live vocals to a parallel compression bus. So a lot of people would just send like the lead vocal. I don't have a good way of swapping out who's being sent to what bus on the current console I'm on. And honestly, I don't find it to be an issue at all anyway. So I send all of the vocals to a bus that is separate from where they normally go to the master bus. And I have a high pass filter on that bus at like 140, barely doing anything because they're already high pass before. And then that bus is I can't remember if it's 4-to-1 or 8-to-1. Doesn't really matter. A 13 millisecond attack. I think 150 release. Maybe it's more like 220. Somewhere in that range. And I compress it roughly about like 7, 8, maybe 10 dB. And then I will take that bus and pull the whole, like the volume of that bus down 10 dB. And that tends to be the right like gluing amount where I'm compressing just about as much as I'm turning it down. So what it basically does is when they're quiet, it raises everyone up. And then when they dig in, it doesn't really actually change the volume that much. And this is really great for really dynamic singers. It also just takes the vocals and just kind of pulls them forward. I don't really know how to explain it. You just kind of have to hear it to really get it. But it does a certain like professional polish to them that I just can't get the vocal to pop out of the speakers quite how I want without it. You don't have to do this. It is a, last kind of sprinkles on top type of situation, but it is pretty great if you can pull it off. Something to be aware of is, especially depending on the console you're using, the time alignment of that you can get really messed up with. So I've found typically, this is technically not something, it's breaking a rule, but it has been fine in the past. I'm mixing on a Yamaha CL5 right now. It does not have automatic delay compensation. I send the vocals straight to the master bus and I send them to this mix bus, and I just use the built-in compressor and EQ. So I'm certainly not sending this out to Waves or anything. No like fancy built-in plugins or anything. Those will all add latency. Just the built-in console EQ, and then that is going to the master bus. Technically that's wrong. Sounds great. So I guess I don't care, but it does kind of bother me if you can't tell. Okay, so that is finally vocals. Moving on from vocals, let's talk about reverb and effects. Most of the reverb and effects that I use are on console. So I'm using a Yamaha. They have decent reverb and effects. I do have one reverb that is in Waves that is just some big long room reverb that's like 5 seconds long. It's huge. But most of the reverbs for the drums, the vocals, everything is on the console. Delay is 100% on the console. I run 2 delays. I run a normal quarter note delay, and then I also run a dotted eighth and normal eighth delay that is like ping-ponging side to side. Pretty sure that's what I'm doing. I should go check. And that works really well. I kind of use the normal quarter note delay as my always on when reverb's on delay. And then the ping-ponging side to side one is my like, this is a huge moment, send it, or the opposite, where this is a really soft moment and I just want it to feel like they're just drenched in reverb and delay and it's this like really ambient thing. I actually find myself using it more in that scenario than the huge send it moments, interestingly enough. Like I mentioned, there is a reverb and delay, or a reverb in waves. It is just reverb. So that is a really simple style reverb that honestly is kind of designed in a similar way to kind of like just a console reverb. It's not doing any crazy stuff. But I just find that it's a really good, just like obvious fake reverb, I guess. Like it does the reverb sound really well. It doesn't necessarily do the like super perfect ambience feeling thing all that great, but it does a reverb sound really well, which for me is oftentimes kind of what I'm looking for in a live scenario. I want it to feel larger than life and just grand, not just like supernatural. I do also like some other waves reverbs. If I wanted to go with something a little fancier, I really do like the IR Live plugin. There's like a really big, long, huge, like 5-second hall or something in there that sounds awesome. I love that thing. Now here's the biggest thing to know with all reverbs and also delay. More with delay, you really want to filter pretty aggressively. So I tend to filter delays at like nothing below like 280 gets in and nothing above like 3K is really a part of it. Most of the time, I found that's kind of a sweet spot. With reverbs, the biggest thing for me when using reverbs, especially like for live stuff, is just don't be afraid to EQ your reverbs. Like your reverbs that you're gonna have access to are probably not the best sounding reverbs in the world. And like I said, sometimes that's kind of to your advantage. You want kind of a cheap reverby sounding reverb. That's a weird way of saying it, but I think you probably get what I mean in a live setting, just to give that separation without blurring things too much. You already have a room reverb in like every single live mixing scenario, basically ever, unless you're outside on a field, but even then. So I am aggressive about being willing to make a reverb sound however I want it to sound through EQ. My go-to thing to describe it is kind of just like EQ a reverb like you EQ a vocal. Just if you've never really EQ'd reverbs before, just try that. I also tend to EQ the returns. If you EQ the send or the return, it is a very different sound. Play with it, try it out. I tend to find I have more control over the returns. I will sometimes like filter the send, so I'm not sending like boominess or super high like sibilant stuff to it. But EQ the returns, EQ them aggressively and be free about it. Like I am not ashamed of how ugly my EQs on my reverb sound because they sound great. And that's what you're doing here. This is audio, not video. Who cares what it looks like if it sounds good? So just a little note there. Do not be afraid of EQing your reverbs. On to the final thing, which is the master bus. And I just need to have a caveat here saying you don't need to process your master bus. Like this is a sugar on top, last step, can be great, can really do good things, but can also get you in trouble and just is not necessary. Right now, I do have a compressor on the master bus, but for months I was not, and it was fine. No one was complaining. It was totally sounded great. My go-to plugins for a master bus are the API 2500. That thing is ridiculously good. I love it on a master bus. I've kind of been going back and forth on my settings on if I do like a really fast attack and a like fast release to kind of like have the snare hit, pull everything down, and it's a whole complicated thing. Or just do something like a 10 millisecond attack and a like 250 millisecond release with just 2 or 3 dB of compression, and it just does this like glue thing that just holds everything together in a way that is just awesome. Really gives it like a professional polish. But like I said, you can really mess yourself up with this thing too, because if it starts getting past 2 or 3 dB, it can start just doing weird things and damage your sound. So you want to set this when the band is on full kill, like make sure that they are playing big, set it so it's just barely doing anything, and then don't worry about the fact that it's not compressing when things are lighter. That's like kind of the point. It's okay. Sometimes I will use tape saturation on the master bus. It can sometimes, it gives you a different sound. It gives it a more analog sound, it gives you kind of a warmer sound, but you will lose some just like pristine clarity. So saturation's great though, and can really glue things together. So maybe give it a try. My go-to for Waves plugins is the J37. Just make sure with that you're not like laying into the tape too hard and like ruining it, because you can absolutely do that. So just adjust the input gain, especially when you're using saturation plugins, and just like make sure it's subtle. And then the last thing is the L2. It is absolutely by far my favorite like Waves limiter, and honestly, maybe my outright favorite limiter. Waves L1 and L3 both sound cleaner, but L2 sounds better, in my opinion. So I don't have any possible way of explaining why that is, but I just think L2 sounds best. And that can also prevent you, if you set it up right, and like, be a little careful here, but you can set it up so that you literally cannot clip your mains, like your actual like speakers. Like you would clip there and it won't clip, it'll limit, which is really what you want. But also just make sure that your limiter is not hitting more than like 3 dB. If you do more than that, you're just going to start losing like power and like the punch of your kick and snare, and like just limit it to 3. All right. I'm sure I've forgotten something. Oh, I'll just run through panning real quick. On drums, kick and snare are dead center. If you run 2 toms, I do 20% left, 20% right. If I run 4, I did 40, 20, 20, 40. On 3, I think I do like 30, 15, 40. I don't know. Basically, put it how it is in real life. Another thing, overheads, pan them. I tend to not hard pan them. I do like, it goes to like 63 on a Yamaha. I put it at like 50. So it's just like almost all the way hard panned, but not quite. Do drummer perspective, unless there's something like really obvious where you're looking at it and there's a camera shot straight on and they're like doing this and it's like opposite. Other than that, do drummer perspective. Here's the reason. Nobody is going to notice but drummers. And drummers want to hear it how they hear it when they play. So just do drummer perspective. That's kick, snare, toms, overheads. I don't run a hi-hat mic. If you need more hi-hat, gate your snare less hard. It'll be there. All right. Piano or keys is hard panned. Electric guitars, I have been doing like 45, 15, 15, 45 on either side if there's 2. If there's 1, probably do like a 30, 30. Not 100% sure. Maybe hard panned. Also, don't be afraid to mono electric guitars. So we have a few different guitar players, and one of them, like I have the rhythm typically on one side and I'll do like 45, 15, and the lead, this guy, his stuff just sounds better monoed. And so put him at 30, who cares? And just keep them in position. Bass is obviously just panned straight up the middle. There's absolutely no reason to pan a bass. Ever. Please don't. And then vocals. Controversial take here. I tend to just put them all dead center. There is a strong argument to be made for having background vocalists spread out a little bit. And I think in a perfect environment, I would do that. But on a loud live stage, I've found that when you pan out vocals, like you're going to end up with like, if you know how I've been talking about, like the snare drum will sometimes get in through the vocals. Those two vocal mics are going to be in different positions on the stage. So they're going to be at different times. So you're ending up with like, you could end up with multiple snare drums at different timings and pannings in your mix. And the phasing that can happen and just like smudging of everything can be awful. So if you're struggling with like just bleed on stage into your vocal mics, try just panning them all up dead center. And then at least the like bleed of all that is already in line with the snare. And so it's not going to like smear it across the, you know, whole width of your mix, basically. I don't know if that made sense. But anyway, yeah. Tracks. Oh, I never talked about tracks. I basically just run a stereo tracks. I mix them in the DAW first and then hard pan it. Normally that's fine. Just make sure that all the different songs are the consistent level so you're not chasing it throughout the whole event. What else is there? Honestly, that kind of feels like it. I do run subs on an aux. I feel like that's the way. Feel free to fight me on that in the comments. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know about any tips or tricks that you guys do. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.